Hello, good morning, everyone. Let's start. It's time to start. Before we begin today's topic, I have also a couple of quick announcements. First, they're gonna be our last quiz on June 23rd, which is next Tuesday. Make sure to review the material we're covered so far. We're gonna cover elasticity of supply and what we will gonna learn on next Monday. Um, and second, your midterm score should be posted by this Friday, and once they're released, please take a look and let me know if you notice any grading issues or any concerns about it. Like, please let me know as soon as possible. And I'm always like happy to help you out, so please contact me. Before we starting, let's briefly remind ourselves what we've learned today until today. So last few classes, like we've spent a lot of time talking about like supply and demand. And also we learned how consumers respond to prices, right? Through the like low of demand and how producers also respond through the low of supply. And we also learned about elasticity of like demand. So on the top of that, we're going to learn something called elasticity of supply. Yeah. So these are pretty similar to the like elasticity of like demand. So let's try to like recap ourselves. So like the law of supply tells us like when prices increases, sellers are willing to supply more, right? But that's yeah, same as like demand case, like but that's only telling us like the direction of change. So now we want to know like the magnitude, right? So like suppose the price of like coffee increases by 10%, then we learn about like how will, consumers increases or decreases their consumption, right? Now we're talking about like will producers increase output? Like how much they will gonna increase their output once after, like price of like something is increased. So like those are very different situations, but also similar to the demand one. So let's talk about it. This is like exactly why we use elasticity, because like elasticity we talked about, which measures like responsiveness. In here, like we're gonna like take care of like, responsiveness of supplier, which is seller. So if you go to like definition of like elasticity, elasticity tells us like how strongly buyers or sellers react, when market condition change. So like think about like in this way. Imagine you on bakery. Yeah. If the price of like bread rises slightly, can you immediately produce like twice as much as like bread tomorrow? Probably not. Maybe you don't have like enough workers, or maybe you don't have like enough like ovens, or your ovens are already operating at full capacity. So like in that case, like your supply is relatively, unresponsive. Like on the other hand, like maybe we can imagine that you sell maybe cell phone or something, and if demand suddenly increases, like producing additional copies like probably costs almost nothing. So like if that is the case, like you can expand your output very easily, and that mean, there would be much more response supply. So, like elasticity measures like exactly this responsiveness. To specifically, like today we're gonna talk about like price elasticity of like supply, which is aka PS. So price elasticity of like supply measures, like how responsive sellers are to price change. So high PES means sellers react strongly. So like low PES means, like sellers react only a little. So one thing to remember is unlike demand elasticity, which often has a negative sign because like price and quantity demanded like move in opposite direction because of the like, like law of demand. Supply elasticity is positive. Let's think about like why. Because, like price and quantity supplied move in the same direction. So when if you recall that, like when price rise, like quantity supplied rises as well. And when price fall, quantity supplied falls as well. So normally, like we simply report positive value, but just in case, like, you got like something abnormal values, like just like try to take an absolute value. Now, let's do like some technical part. So how to calculate price elasticity of like supply? We also use, like midpoint formula over here. So the basic formula here is like very straightforward. So like price elasticity of like supply equals percentage change in quantity supply divided by percent change in price. So like the challenging is like, calculating percentage change correctly. Because like I've seen a lot of like students are, I don't want to say in that way, not able to like calculate their percentage correctly. So to avoid getting different answers but depending on like which direction we're moving, we use like midpoint method over here as well. And the midpoint is like simply the average of like starting value and ending value. So yeah. And then, how to calculate like, price elasticity of, oh my God, I made a like typo over there. Price elasticity of like supply is also same as like the price ch percent change in quantity. I'm sorry, but supplied that follows from 1% price change. So if you remember this, like, like most elasticity questions become like mechanical calculations, so it'll be easier. So try to like remember, I'm gonna like, yeah, update like that part later. So I brought some quick example over here. Let's practice together. So suppose market price rises from like $12 to $14, and at the same time, like quantity supplied rises from 150 units to 170 units per day. So before touching, like any calculator, let's think economically. So first, like we have like price increased, right? And then also we have quantity supplied increases as well. So like does that match the law of supply? Yeah, like it's easy, right? So higher price, like encourages sellers to produce more. And now we can think of it. Like now let's estimate. Do you think like supply is like elastic or inelastic? Like take a guess. So if the quantity only increased, like slightly compared to the like price increase, we'd expect like inelastic supply. And if quantity increased dramatically, a lot, then we'd expect, like elastic supply. So like let's try to actually calculate, right? So first thing we need to do is, like calculate the percent change in price. So price increases from 12 to 14, the change is 2, and the midpoint will gonna be like 13, right? So once after we just like put all the values like over there, then we got 2 divided 13 multiplied by 100, which is equal to 15.4 approximately. Um, We do the same thing with a change in quantity supplied as well. Quantity increases from 150 to 100 to 70. The change is like 20 and midpoint is like 160. So like 20 divided by 160 times 100, that gives us, like 12.5%. So like notice what happened, like so price increased by about like 15% and quantity supplied increased by about like 12%. So already we can see that like quantity is increasing, but not quite as much as price. So we can guess that, like supply may not be very elastic. So let's see. So like now we plug everything into the formula. So elasticity equals to 12.5% divided by 15.4%. That gives approximately 3. What happened? I'm sorry, I haven't updated. But yeah, that gives us like, approximately like 0.81. The slides haven't updated. I'm sorry. I changed the, like questions by myself and forgot to update it. But yeah, so like just like try to like remember what was the like formula over there, and like once after we plug like that 12.5 divided by 15.4, it gives like us like zero point 0.8. Yeah, that is like, like what elasticity of like supply over there. And like the important thing over there is, like the interpretation. That is what matters. So if elasticity is like greater than one, like quantity responds, like proportionally more than price. And if elasticity is like less than one, like that means like quantity responds like proportionally less than price. So remember like something important, like, along the like supply curve, price and quantity move together. That means like elasticity of like supply is positive, and we generally focus on the size of the like number rather than the sign. Now we move to like elastic and inelastic part. So this is also one of like the most important like concepts, like which is like almost similar to the like demand part. Um like how do we like interpret like elasticity values? Like there are three major categories, like which is almost same logic as demand. So elastic supply means like quantity changes like more than price. Elasticity is like greater than one, like sellers respond strongly. So, we can think of like some examples, like maybe a software company can often increase their production very easily because they creating, like additional copies like costs almost nothing. So like, like if you don't need any like additional cost to like produce more, that means like your supply elastic you are like you're having like elastic supply. Second one is like inelastic supply, which means that quantity changes less than price. So elasticity should be less than one, right? Sellers cannot easily adjust like their productions. Well, like let's think of like farm. So if the like wheat prices like suddenly doubled tomorrow, like farmers like typically cannot instantly create more farmland, because like that is because like production is like mostly constrained, and in this case like we call it as like like inelastic supply. The last one is like unit elastic supply, which where elasticity equals exactly one. So like quantity and price change by the same percentage. So we also discuss, like two other extreme cases, which is, perfectly inelastic supply and perfectly elastic supply. We call perfectly inelastic supply when, elasticity equals to zero. Like quantity never changes. So that is the reason like the supply curve is vertical because like quantity never moves. So no matter what happens to the price, like sellers cannot increase their output. This is very extreme case. So, an example might be land in specific location. I cannot think of one right now, but yeah. But like theoretically it exists, but like in real life, like you would see most cases in between, like perfectly inelastic and perfectly elastic. So, like, perfectly elastic supply is where elasticity is infinite and the supply curve is horizontal. Like, even a tiny change in price will gonna cause extremely, extremely large changes in quantity supplies. So, like, these extremes are very rare, but they kind of like help us understand the concept. So, try to, like, remember them. Oopsie. Okay, I also brought some figures to visualize elasticity. So, like, notice the difference in slope. So, like, a relatively flat supply curve tends to be more elastic, right? That is because, like, quantity changes like substantially, even when price changes only a little. A relative like steep supply curve tends to be more inelastic because like think of it like like price changes a lot but quantity will gonna change only a little bit. So like try to like think about it intuitively, imagine maybe concert venue with maybe fixed seating. Even if like, like ticket prices like double, like the venue cannot suddenly create like thousands of like new seats that's in elastic supply, or we can also think about like Netflix, like something like, online streaming services, Hulu, like something like that. If subscription increases, adding another customer costs like almost nothing. So in this case, like we're gonna say like supply is much more elastic. So, like, just remember the flatter the supply curve, like, the more responsive, like, suppliers are, and the steeper the supply curve, the less responsive, like, suppliers are. So, like, these graphs, like, give us a visual shortcut. Flat usually means elastic, like, steep usually means inelastic, no matter, like, it is supply or demand. All right. Elastic versus inelastic. So this slide explains like something, more about like elastic and inelastic. The same price change like can relate to like very different quantity responses, like we talked about it, because like some industries can adjust like production easily while, like others cannot, of course. Consider two examples like, suppose the price of dress rises, then a clothing factory might increase production fairly quickly because like workers can work, like overtime, additional materials can be ordered, like or something like that. In that case, like, like supply is relatively elastic. Um, like on the other hand, like, like we are gonna say, like supply is like inelastic. So typically, like whenever you are trying to adjust like, like outputs, like production, typically that takes time. Like time, permits, like, like legal something, or equipment, or even investment. Like whenever you need like this type of like resources to increase like your production, we're gonna say, like supply is like more toward to, inelastic. And this kind of like stuff like, brings us to, one of like biggest determinants of elasticity, which is time. We're gonna learn about it soon. So like in a short run, like films, we're gonna like typically face constraint, like something like that. So like, like when in adopt, like just like, remember that, time makes supply more flexible. Let's talk about like those determinant stuff like a little bit more. So like determinant of like, elasticities are the factors that dictate how sensitive consumers or producers are to price change. So for demand, we have like several important factors. First one is availability of like substitutes. So if consumers have like many alternatives, like just like think of it, like demand is like more elastic. For example, you know, maybe Coke and Pepsi. If one becomes expensive, like consumers can easily switch. That means, like demand will gonna be, change very quickly means, like we have elastic demand. And second one could be like proportion of income, which means that, expensive purchases tend to be more elastic. Cause like, like a small percentage increase in price of like car, sh- of course it matters, right? But a small increase, like in the price of what else? Like necessity, like pencil or, instant noodles usually doesn't matter that much compared to, like car. So this is like almost same as like, like necessity and luxury. So like necessity, which is also like think of as, you know, some sort of goods like you really need to consume on a daily basis. So like necessities like, like tend to be inelastic and luxury goods tend to be, like elastic. And next one is like, time horizon. So like demand becomes like more elastic over time because consumers can adjust like their behavior. Um, like the last one is like market definition. Whenever like we're talking about like broader markets, like for example, like all foods, like like something like that, they are they are highly inelastic. And now we will gonna talk about like determinant of like price elasticity of like supply. So first one is like, flexibility of like production. Can producers, like easily change output? If like the answer is like yes, like like supply is elastic, and if the production requires highly specialized facility or something like that, like we call like supply is inelastic. And the second important thing is like, like availability of like inputs. So like this also, related to like their constraint. Can films easily obtain labor and like raw materials? If, like inputs are abundant, like supply is of course gonna be more elastic. But on the other hand, like if inputs are scarce, like supply is less elastic. Everything kind of like makes sense. So like the last one is also same as like time horizon, like time really matters as well as like demand. So like this is like perhaps like the most important determinant of like supply elasticity because like in the longer term, like films have to respond and the easier it becomes to expand their productions. You know, because like in a short run, like films faces constraint, as we said, like limited workers or, like limited machines or limited factory space, like something like that. But in the long run, like after, price increases, films can adapt. So they can build more factories or they can hire, like more workers. And even they can purchase new equipment or new films can enter the market. So as a result, like supply is usually much more elastic in the long run than in the short run. So like this idea kind of like appears like everywhere in economics. So times kind of like make, supply and demand more flexible and gave them like more choices, options to choose. So let's wrap up with the key ideas from today, because this is our last page. Price elasticity of like supply measures, like how responsive sellers are to price changes. We calculated it as, like percent change in quantity supply divided by percent change in price, which is almost same logic as, like demand case. If PS is greater than 1, we say supply is elastic. And if PS is less than 1, like we say supply is inelastic. And also try to remember which figure matches with which. So flat supply curves like tend to be elastic and steep supply curves like tend to be inelastic, which has like same logic as, demand as well. So things are kind of like very easier like when you combine demand and supply together. So try to like, connect them together. Um and perhaps the biggest takeaway from today is supply is like usually more elastic in the long run because films have more time to adjust. Yeah. So like next class, like we'll continue to apply, this supply and demand thing to the market wise. So we're gonna talk about like market failure and government intervention. So that would be like some sort of like real world market situation. Before you leave, please don't forget quizzes on June 23rd, which is next Tuesday, and midterm scores should be posted by Friday. If you have any questions, like please let me know. Any questions before we finish today? If we don't have any questions, thank you for coming. We'll see you on next Monday. Thank you.